Before we begin this chilling tale from the Appalachian Mountains, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's dark journey. If you're watching this, you're about to discover a story that's been buried in county records for over a century. Take a moment to tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious which corners of the world these forgotten stories reach. Tonight, we journey to Hollow Creek, a place that no longer appears on modern maps of West Virginia. For a good reason. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, valleys so deep that sunlight touches the ground for only a few hours each day. Hollows where fog lingers until noon, where sounds carry strangely, where the outside world feels distant and unreal. In these remote places, families lived by their own rules and kept their own counsel. They survived through harsh winters and unforgiving terrain by relying on each other, by maintaining traditions passed down through generations, and by sometimes turning a blind eye to things that couldn't be easily explained. Hollow Creek was one such place, a narrow valley tucked between two steep ridges, with a single dirt road connecting it to the nearest town, nearly 7 miles away. The creek that gave the settlement its name wound through the center of the valley, fed by countless springs that bubbled up from the limestone beneath. In wet seasons it ran clear and strong. In dry summers it sometimes disappeared entirely, leaving behind a rocky bed of smooth stones and dried mud. When that happened, the wells became lifelines. In the summer of 1900, the Carter family was like many others in McDowell County, coal miners by necessity, farmers by heritage. Their property sat nestled between two ridges where the morning fog lingered until noon, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were respected. Ezekiel Carter, the patriarch, had worked the same coal seam for 23 years without missing a single day. His wife, Martha, kept a garden that produced enough vegetables to trade with neighbors. They had 3 children, Joseph, the eldest at 19, Rebecca 17, and young Thomas, just 11. What made the Carters different from their neighbors wasn't their industry or their modesty, it was their well. The Carter homestead had stood for 3 generations, built by Ezekiel's grandfather shortly after the Civil War. The original structure was a simple one-room cabin, but each generation had added to it a bedroom here, a larger kitchen there, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. By 1900, it was a proper farmhouse, though modest by the standards of wealthier regions. The walls were solid oak, the floors pine, the roof recently redone with cedar shingles that Martha had insisted upon despite the expense. A roof that leaks, she was known to say, is an invitation to ruin. The property stretched across 35 acres, though only about 10 were suitable for farming. The rest was too steep, too rocky, or too heavily wooded to clear with the technology of the time. The Carter children had grown up exploring those woods, learning which mushrooms were safe to eat, which plants had medicinal properties, which areas were prone to rock slides after heavy rain. They knew every inch of their land, except for the area around the well. Every property in Hollow Creek had a well, of course. Water was life, especially when the creek ran dry in late summer. But the Carter well was different. It sat unusually far from the house, beyond a stand of ancient oak trees, almost hidden from view. Neighbors noticed that the Carters were peculiar about their well. They never drew water after dusk. Children were forbidden from approaching it. And most strangely, Ezekiel had built a wooden cover for it that was secured with not 1, but 3 separate locks. The well itself appeared ordinary enough, a circular stone structure about 4 feet high and 5 feet across, with a wooden windlass for lowering and raising the bucket. But unlike other wells in the hollow, it had no roof, just the heavy wooden cover that fit tightly over the opening. The stones used in its construction were local limestone, but oddly they seemed darker than the same stone used elsewhere, as if permanently damp or stained with something that wouldn't wash away. Just being cautious, he would say, when asked about the elaborate security measures. A child could fall in. A reasonable explanation. But it didn't explain why, on certain nights, lantern light could be seen flickering near the well after the family should have been asleep. It didn't explain the occasional sounds that drifted across the property, sounds that resembled weeping, and it certainly didn't explain why the county records office in Charleston contains a sealed file about the Carter property that requires special permission to access even today. William Tanner, who delivered mail to the Hollow twice weekly, noted in his personal journal that the Carter children were prohibited from collecting water, a task normally assigned to young ones in most households. Only Ezekiel draws from that well, he wrote in 1897. I've delivered mail when Martha was hanging laundry not 50 yards away, yet she walked all the way to the creek rather than use the closer water source. When I remarked upon it, she changed the subject abruptly. There's something queer about that family's relationship with their well. The Reverend Samuel Thorne, who served the small church in Hollow Creek for over 40 years, wrote in his private journal, now preserved in the State Historical Archives, about his concerns regarding the Carter family. Ezekiel is a God-fearing man, he wrote in an entry dated 1898, but there is a shadow over that household that prayer alone cannot lift. Martha no longer takes communion, and the children seem to carry a weight beyond their years. When I inquired about visiting their homestead to offer pastoral guidance, Ezekiel politely but firmly refused. Some burdens, he told me, must be carried by family alone. I fear what secrets that family harbors. In another entry, dated Christmas 1899, Reverend Thorne described an incident that troubled him deeply. Young Thomas Carter remained after service today, lingering until the church had emptied. The boy has always been quiet, but today he seemed positively haunted. When I asked what troubled him, he began to speak of dreams, terrible dreams of the deep dark, as he called it, dreams where something called to him from far below the earth. "It knows my name," the child whispered. "It knows all our names." Before I could inquire further, Ezekiel appeared at the door, his face like thunder. Thomas went to his father immediately, head bowed as if in shame. Ezekiel nodded to me curtly, but said nothing. As they walked away, I observed his hand on the boy's shoulder, not comforting, but restraining, almost warning. I pray for that child's soul. The summer of 1900 was unusually hot and dry in southern West Virginia, the kind of heat that makes men irritable and women worry about their gardens, the kind of drought that makes a reliable water source invaluable. In Hollow Creek, families with failing wells would normally help each other, sharing resources until the rains returned. But no one ever asked to use the Carter well. Not once in 20 years. By June, the creek had dwindled to a trickle, then disappeared entirely along most of its length. Gardens withered. Livestock grew thin and irritable. Dust hung in the air, coating every surface, working its way into lungs until people coughed just from breathing. The heat was relentless, the humidity oppressive. At night, families slept on porches seeking relief that never came. Children grew listless, adults short-tempered. But through it all, the Carter garden remained strangely verdant, their livestock healthy, their water supply apparently unaffected by the drought that plagued their neighbors. Harold Jenkins, whose farm bordered the Carter property to the east, would later tell investigators that even his livestock refused to graze near the tree line that separated their lands. "Animals know things we don't," he said. "My dogs would bark at nothing, staring into those trees, and the birds, there weren't any birds in those oaks. Not a single nest, not a single song. Like they knew to stay away." Jenkins also reported that during the worst of the drought, he had once approached Ezekiel about accessing the Carter well, offering to pay for the privilege. "He turned white as a sheet," Jenkins recalled, "told me it wasn't possible, that the well was unreliable. Unreliable, when his own crops were the only green ones for miles around. I pressed him, mentioned that my youngest was showing signs of fever from the heat, that we were desperate. He looked at me strange then, like he was considering something terrible. Then he said, 'Harold, if you value your family, you'll find water elsewhere. Some prices are too high, even for a child's health.' He gave me a jug of water from his own supply and hurried away. I never asked again." County Clerk Simmons, whose meticulous records form the backbone of this account, noted that June of 1900 marked the driest spell in recorded history for the region. He also noted, with the careful precision of a man who documented births, deaths, and property transfers with equal impartiality, that it was on June 17th when Thomas Carter first began to act strangely. It started with the boy refusing to go to school. Thomas had always been a diligent student, walking the 3 miles to the one-room schoolhouse without complaint. But that Monday, Martha found him hiding in the root cellar, trembling, insisting he couldn't leave the house. When pressed, the boy would only say, "I saw something I shouldn't have. At the well, Pa will be angry." Martha Carter had been born a Sullivan from a family known for their practical nature and no-nonsense approach to life. She had married Ezekiel at 16, bearing their first child barely a year later. By all accounts, she had been a vibrant young woman, quick to laugh, with a talent for music and storytelling that made her popular at community gatherings. But photographs from the late 1890s show a different person, a woman who had aged beyond her years, her eyes shadowed, her smile perfunctory when it appeared at all. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable, beginning, according to her sister's later testimony, around the time Ezekiel deepened the well during the drought of 97. Martha, by all accounts a practical woman not given to coddling, initially scolded the boy for his behavior that June morning. But something in his expression, a haunted look that no child should wear, gave her pause. She allowed him to stay home, telling neighbors he had a summer fever. That night, witnesses report hearing a heated argument between Martha and Ezekiel that continued well past midnight. Ida Morrison, whose cottage stood close enough to the Carter property that voices carried on still nights, later told Sheriff Harrison that she had never heard the Carters quarrel before. "They were always so private," she said. But that night, Martha's voice rose like I'd never heard. "We can't keep doing this," she kept saying. And Ezekiel, his voice was strange, deeper than usual, almost like he was speaking through water. "We have no choice," he said. "It's us or it's them." I didn't know what he meant then. God help me, I wish I still didn't. Morrison also reported hearing another sound that night, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from beneath the ground, like something heavy being repeatedly dropped, or like a massive heartbeat. "It wasn't like anything I'd heard before," she said. "It made my own heart speed up, made me feel like prey that hears a predator approaching. I plugged my ears, but I could still feel it, in the floorboards, in my bones. It continued until dawn, stopping only when the roosters crowed. The next day, Ezekiel didn't go to the mine. The foreman noted his absence, the first in over 2 decades. Instead, Ezekiel spent the entire day at the well, replacing the wooden cover with a thicker one, reinforcing the locks, and digging a shallow trench around its perimeter. Neighbors observed him working tirelessly, pausing only when Martha brought him water, not from their well, but from the creek nearly a mile away. Elijah Stone, a traveling peddler who passed through Hollow Creek that day, would later give a statement to authorities in Charleston about what he witnessed. "I've been selling my wares through these mountains for 30 years, he said. "I know the difference between a man working and a man performing a ritual. Carter wasn't just reinforcing that well, he was warding it, though against what, I couldn't say. He had symbols carved into the underside of that new cover, nothing I recognized from any Christian tradition. And he was muttering as he worked, not prayers exactly, more like promises, bargaining with something. I offered to sell him some tools for his project, but he sent me away with such vehemence that I didn't even try to approach the house to sell to his wife. Some houses feel wrong, officer. That one felt wrong in ways I can't properly explain. Dr. Wilson, who had treated the Carter family for minor ailments over the years, happened to be passing by that afternoon, returning from attending a difficult birth at a farm further up the hollow. He later reported that he stopped to speak with Ezekiel, concerned by the man's appearance. "He looked like he hadn't slept in days," the doctor wrote in notes that were later confiscated by federal authorities. "His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling. When I asked if he was ill, He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "The well is sick," he told me, "not me." When I pressed him on what he meant, he grew agitated, insisting I leave immediately. As I mounted my horse, he called after me, "If anything happens to us, burn it all. Don't look inside anything. Just burn it all." In a separate entry, dated 2 days later, Dr. Wilson noted that he had been called to the Carter home to examine young Thomas, who was reportedly suffering from sleepwalking episodes. The boy was physically healthy, he wrote, but mentally agitated. His pupils were unusually dilated, his pulse rapid. When I attempted to question him about his sleep disturbances, he became highly distressed, speaking in what his mother called nonsense. But it wasn't nonsense. It was Latin, though no Latin I've ever encountered in medical texts. When I mentioned this to Martha, she burst into tears. Ezekiel escorted me out immediately, pressing payment into my hand with unusual urgency. As I was leaving, I noticed a peculiar odor in the house, not unclean, but unfamiliar. Like the smell of a cave, damp and mineral, but with an underlying note of something organic, decaying perhaps, though not putrid, more like fermentation, but unwholesome somehow. Rebecca, the 17-year-old daughter, confided in her friend Sarah Williams that Thomas had been sleepwalking. "He tries to go to the well at night," she whispered after church that Sunday. "Pa has to lock his bedroom door from the outside. And Thomas, he doesn't sound like himself when they find him. He speaks differently, like someone else is using his mouth." Sarah would later recall that Rebecca's normally bright demeanor had dimmed considerably in recent weeks. "She used to laugh all the time," Sarah told the investigators. "But that spring, something changed. She stopped talking about the future, about the teaching position she wanted in Charleston, or the man she hoped to marry someday. It was like she couldn't see beyond tomorrow. The last thing she ever said to me was, 'If you don't hear from me after this week, don't come looking. Just remember me as I was before.'" Rebecca had been keeping a diary that spring, a small leather-bound book given to her by the schoolteacher who had recognized her academic potential. The diary was discovered after the tragedy, hidden beneath a floorboard in her room, one of the few personal items to survive the fire. Most of its pages contain ordinary entries, observations about daily life, notes on books she had read, innocent musings about boys in the community. But beginning in late May 1900, the entries take a darker turn. "Thomas isn't the only one who hears it calling," she wrote on May 30th. "I hear it too, though I pretend not to. It's worst at night when the house is quiet. It knows my name. It knows what I want most, to leave this place, to see the world beyond these mountains. It promises to show me things no human has ever seen, places beneath the world. I know it's a lie, but sometimes when I'm half asleep, the lie sounds better than the truth." On June 10th, she wrote, "Joseph knows something is wrong. I see him watching Pa, watching the well. He asked me today if I've noticed anything strange about the water. Said it sometimes looks different in certain lights, moves differently than water should. I pretended not to understand, but I've seen it too. How it sometimes seems to flow upward against the rim of a cup. How it sometimes leaves stains that can't be washed out. How it sometimes seems to watch you back when you look into it." Her final entry, dated June 22nd, consists of just 3 lines. "It's getting stronger. Pa can't contain it much longer. I should run, but where would I go? It would follow. It always follows." The Williams girl shared this conversation with her father, who included it in a letter to his brother in Charleston, a letter that somehow found its way into those sealed county records. What makes this document particularly valuable is that it was written before anyone knew what would happen next, before the tragedy that would erase Hollow Creek from memory and maps alike. "I fear for the Carter girl," Williams wrote. "There is a darkness in that family that seems to be consuming them one by one. Ezekiel has grown gaunt and harsh, Martha withdrawn and fearful. The youngest boy speaks strangely, when he speaks at all. Only Joseph seems to be fighting whatever affliction grips them. But for how long? If I didn't know better, I would say they were being poisoned, perhaps by their well water, though no one has taken ill from the creek that runs through their property." Rebekah spoke of her brother going to the well at night, drawn to it against his will. I cannot help but wonder if there might be some mineral in that water that affects the mind. Coal mining has poisoned many water sources in these mountains. Perhaps this is simply a tragedy of that nature rather than something more superstitious. Either way, I have advised Sarah to distance herself from the family, at least until the situation resolves itself one way or another. Joseph Carter, the eldest son, had always been his father's right hand, in the fields, in the mine, and in maintaining the family's reputation in the community. Tall and solemn, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's thoughtful eyes, Joseph was considered a prime marriage prospect by local families with daughters. Yet he had shown little interest in courtship, devoting himself instead to helping his father with increasingly frequent repairs to the well. A daguerreotype taken at a church gathering in the spring of 1900 shows Joseph standing slightly apart from the rest of the community, his expression watchful rather than relaxed. Though only 19, his face already showed lines of strain around the eyes and mouth that made him appear much older. His hands, visible at his sides, were calloused not just from farm work and mining, but from rope burns, unusual marks that several people had commented on in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Edward Davis, who worked alongside Joseph in the mine, later testified that Joseph had grown increasingly withdrawn that spring. "He used to join in when we'd sing to keep rhythm with our work," Davis said, "but he stopped. When I asked him why, he just shook his head and said, 'I don't feel like I have the right to sing anymore.' He had rope burns on his hands most days, and his clothes smelled of something I couldn't place, something sharp and wrong, like meat gone bad, but not quite. When the foreman asked about it, Joseph said they were having trouble with their well, that they had to clean it regularly now." Davis also recalled an incident in early June that had troubled him deeply. "We were working a new seam, deeper than before. Joseph was using the pick, and he hit something that made a sound, not like coal or rock, but like something hollow, maybe metal. He froze, his face going white, started muttering, 'Not here too, please God, not here too.' The foreman came over to see what he'd found, but Joseph had already covered it back up, broken the coal over it, said it was nothing, just echoed strange in the tunnel. But he refused to work that seam again. Switched places with me for the rest of the day, and the next morning that part of the tunnel had collapsed mysteriously overnight. No one questioned it. Cave-ins happen. But I always wondered what he found down there that frightened him so badly." On the night of June 23rd, during a new moon that draped the mountains in perfect darkness, Joseph Carter woke to the sound of the front door closing. Half asleep, he assumed his father was making a trip to the outhouse. But when he heard the distinct sound of multiple locks being turned, he became fully alert. No one used the outhouse with a key. In his testimony, portions of which remain heavily redacted in the official record, Joseph described pulling on his trousers and moving to the window. The night was so dark that he could barely make out the shapes of the trees, but a faint light flickered beyond them, near where the well stood. It wasn't a steady light, like a lantern, he said. It pulsed like breathing, and there was a smell coming through the window, like the mine when we hit a pocket of bad air, but worse, like something that had been sealed away for 1,000 years. The smell, Joseph would later testify, was what finally drove him to action. It was familiar, the same odor that had clung to his father's clothes for months, that sometimes wafted from the well when the wind was right. But that night it was stronger than ever, a miasma that seemed to thicken the air itself, making it difficult to breathe, to think clearly. It was like the air itself was becoming something else, he said, something that had never been meant to be breathed by human lungs. Joseph later told Sheriff Harrison that he got up and looked out his window. In the deep darkness, he could just make out a figure moving toward the well. Thinking it was Thomas sleepwalking again, he quietly made his way downstairs, careful not to wake his parents. What he found instead would change everything. His father was not in bed, neither was his mother. Their room was empty, the bed covers pulled back as if they had left in a hurry. More concerning was that Thomas's room was still locked from the outside. The boy was inside, calling Joseph's name in a whisper that somehow carried through the thick wooden door. "Don't go outside," Thomas said when Joseph unlocked his door. "Don't go near the well. They're feeding it again." In the dim light of the oil lamp Joseph had lit, Thomas looked smaller than his 11 years, huddled in the corner of his bed, a blanket pulled up to his chin despite the summer heat. His eyes, normally bright blue like his mother's, seemed darker, the pupils so dilated that the iris was just a thin ring. Joseph would later describe his brother's appearance as like someone had hollowed him out and was looking through his eyes from somewhere far away. The boy's skin was clammy to the touch, his pulse rapid but weak. His breathing came in short, shallow gasps, as if he couldn't get enough air. Joseph noticed that Thomas's fingernails were torn and bloody, as if he had been clawing at something, the door, perhaps, or his own skin. There were scratches on his arms, his neck, his face, self-inflicted wounds that looked like an attempt to dig something out from under the surface. "What do you mean, feeding it?" Joseph asked, his hand still on the doorknob, ready to close the door again if Thomas lunged for him. Something that had happened twice before, according to Rebecca's diary, found later beneath a floorboard in her room. "The thing in the well," Thomas replied, his voice oddly flat. "It came with the coal. Pa found it when he was digging the well deeper during the drought 3 years ago. It was sleeping in the rock, but the pick woke it up. Now it's hungry all the time. It wants to get out." Thomas began to rock back and forth, a keening sound escaping his lips. "It gets in your head when you're sleeping," he whispered. "It shows you things, what it wants to do once it's free. It showed me what it did to the people who lived here before there were towns. Before there were names for this place." Joseph, unsure whether to comfort his brother or flee the house entirely, took a hesitant step into the room. "Thomas, you're not making sense. There's nothing in the well except water." Thomas's laugh was high and sharp, like breaking glass. "Water? We haven't drawn water from that well in 3 years. What's down there isn't water, and it's using Pa now. It's almost strong enough to climb out on its own." The boy's eyes suddenly focused, becoming more present than they had been in weeks. "Joseph, listen to me. It's changing us. First Pa, then Ma. Rebecca's starting to change too. I can feel it trying to change me, but I fight it when I'm awake. It gets me when I sleep, though. That's why they lock me in. Not to keep me from the well, to keep whatever's in me from getting back to the well." Joseph knelt beside the bed, taking his brother's cold hands in his. "Thomas, you're sick. You have a fever. You're not making sense." Thomas pulled his hands away violently. "I'm the only one making sense. The only one still fighting. It got into Pa through his skin when he was digging, through cuts on his hands. Then it got into Ma when they—" He broke off, shuddering. "It spreads, Joseph. Through water. Through touch. Through—" A sound from outside, metal on stone, made both brothers freeze. Joseph moved to the window, careful to stay to one side, so he wouldn't be visible from below. What he saw made his blood run cold. Against his better judgment, against the pleading of his younger brother, Joseph took a lantern and walked toward the well. Rebecca, woken by the commotion, followed at a distance. What they witnessed that night is documented in testimonies given separately, yet matching in all key details. Testimonies that were quickly suppressed, but preserved in those sealed records. As they approached the stand of oak trees, the darkness seemed to deepen, as if the night itself was thicker there. The air grew colder with each step, unusual for a June night in West Virginia. Joseph would later describe a sensation, like walking into a cave that goes down forever, like something ancient was breathing against my skin. The smell grew stronger as they neared the well, that same cave-like odor that had permeated the house, but more intense, more alive somehow. Joseph's lantern flickered, the flame dimming, as if struggling against some force that didn't want light to penetrate this space. The ground beneath their feet felt strange, not the familiar soil of their property, but something slicker, almost membranous, that seemed to yield slightly with each step, then firm again once weight was removed. Beyond the trees they saw lantern light. Their parents were at the well, the heavy cover removed. Between them they carried something wrapped in a bedsheet, something that appeared to be moving. The well itself was larger than Joseph remembered, the opening wider, the stone collar around its mouth cracked and stained with a dark substance that glistened in the lantern light. And from within its depths came a sound that Rebecca would later describe as like water moving through a pipe, but thicker, wetter, like something viscous flowing upward against gravity. Joseph called out, and his parents turned in shock. Martha screamed, not in fear of being discovered, but in warning. "Run!" she cried. "Take your brother and sister and run!" In the lantern light, Joseph could see that his mother's face was gaunt, her eyes sunken. She had lost weight since spring, her dress hanging loosely on her frame. But it was the expression she wore that frightened him most, a mixture of resignation and horror, as if she was watching the inevitable approach of something she had long dreaded. Her skin had an odd grayish cast to it, and her movements were stiff, jerky, as if she were a puppet being operated by an unskilled handler. Joseph noticed dark veins standing out against her pale skin, veins that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that didn't match a human heartbeat, that sometimes appeared to move beneath the surface like worms burrowing through soil. Ezekiel's reaction was different. He stepped away from the well, placing himself between his children and whatever was inside it. "Go back to the house," he commanded. "This doesn't concern you. This is to protect you." In the unsteady light, Joseph saw that his father's hands were stained to the wrists with the same dark substance that marked the well's edge. His clothing was soaked with it, and when he spoke, Joseph noticed that his father's teeth had the same dark stain between them, as if he had been drinking the substance, or as if it had been drinking him. Ezekiel's eyes reflected the lantern light strangely, not with the normal red-orange glint of human eyes in darkness, but with a bluish sheen, like the eyes of a nocturnal animal. There was something wrong with the shape of his pupils, too. They weren't round, but vertical slits, like a cat's, or something older, more reptilian. "Pa," Joseph said, taking a step forward, "what's in the well? What are you doing out here?" But it was too late. Rebecca had moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her caution. She saw what was in the bundle. She saw what was in the well. And what she saw caused her to make a sound that Joseph would later describe as not a scream, but something worse, like her soul was trying to tear itself from her body. The official record states that the bundle contained supplies, food and water, for a journey, that Ezekiel and Martha were planning to abandon their children and flee west. This is the story that was circulated, the explanation given for what followed. But Joseph's testimony, sealed for a century, tells a different story. "The bundle was moving because it contained our neighbor's infant son," Joseph testified. "The baby had gone missing 3 days earlier. The whole hollow had been searching for him, and my parents, they were lowering him into the well, but not to drown him, to feed him to what lived down there." The Miller infant, James, just 4 months old, had disappeared from his cradle while his mother was hanging laundry less than 50 yards away. The community had organized search parties, combing the woods, dragging the deeper pools of the creek, even searching abandoned mine shafts. No one had thought to search the Carter property. The Carters themselves had been among the most diligent searchers, with Martha comforting the distraught mother while Ezekiel led men through the surrounding forest. "The baby was still alive," Joseph continued, his voice breaking. "I could see his tiny hand reaching out from the bundle, his fingers opening and closing. And from the well I could hear sounds of anticipation, not splashing, not water, something eager." Martha tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a frantic whisper as she grabbed Joseph's arm. "We had no choice," she said. "It was the baby, or all of us. It's been taking livestock for years, but that's not enough anymore. It wants people. It threatens to come out at night, to take us all. Your father made a deal. 1 life to save the rest of the hollow. The Millers have 5 other children. They'll recover. But if that thing gets out..." Her grip on Joseph's arm was unnaturally strong, her fingers digging in so deeply that they left bruises that wouldn't fade for weeks. And where she touched him, Joseph felt a strange sensation, a cold burning, as if something was trying to seep from her skin into his. He pulled away instinctively, and Martha didn't pursue him. Instead, her expression changed from pleading to something harder, more calculating. "You'll understand soon," she said, her voice deepening, becoming less her own. "Everyone will understand. We're just the beginning." "The well wasn't a well," Joseph stated. "Not anymore. Pa said it had been dug to reach water, but they found something else instead. Something that had been buried in the mountain before there were people here. Something that had been sleeping until the mining woke it up." Rebecca had fallen to her knees at the well's edge, staring down into its depths with an expression of horrified fascination. "It's so beautiful," she whispered. "So perfect. All those teeth, all those eyes. It wants to show us things. It wants to take us places." Joseph reported that Rebecca's eyes had taken on the same strange sheen as their father's, that bluish glow that wasn't reflection but something emanating from within. Her movements had become fluid, almost graceful, but wrong somehow, bending at angles that human joints shouldn't permit, flowing rather than stepping. She leaned further over the well's edge, her long hair dangling dangerously close to the surface of whatever filled the depths. Martha lunged for Rebecca, trying to pull her away from the well's edge, but she was too late. Rebecca had seen what was rising from the depths, what was reaching for the bundle, what had been consuming their livestock, their neighbors' missing pets, and, if Thomas's ravings were to be believed, at least one drifter who had sought shelter with the Carters during the previous winter. "Not yet," Martha hissed, but she wasn't speaking to Rebecca. She was addressing whatever was in the well. "We had an agreement. The child first, then we bring the others. One by one, as agreed. You must be patient." Joseph, frozen in horror, saw something emerge from the well, something that the official record describes as a sick bear or mountain cat, driven mad by rabies or starvation. But what Joseph described was something else entirely, something that had never walked in sunlight, never breathed air, something that had evolved in darkness, feeding on whatever fell into its domain beneath the mountains. "It wasn't anything I had words for," he testified. "It moved like water, but had substance. It had appendages, but they weren't limbs as we understand them. They were possibilities, like it hadn't decided what shape to take yet. And eyes, so many eyes, not placed in any pattern that made sense, just scattered across its surface. They all blinked at different times. They all looked in different directions, but they all saw." Ezekiel grabbed his mining pick, the tool he'd used for 23 years without fail. "Get back to the house," he ordered Joseph. "Take your mother and siblings and lock yourselves in. Don't come out until morning, no matter what you hear." But as Ezekiel raised the pick, his movements suddenly jerked to a stop. He stood rigid, trembling, as if fighting against some invisible force. "It's in me," he gasped, his voice strained. "It's been in me since I first broke through to its chamber, little by little. Every time I fed it, it took more of me, and now it's ready." Joseph watched in horror as his father's body began to change, subtle at first, then more dramatically. His spine elongated, his shoulders widened, his neck extended. The changes weren't the product of broken bones or tearing flesh. It was more as if his body had become clay, malleable and fluid, being reshaped from within by something that had a different understanding of what a body should be. "Run," Ezekiel managed to say, his voice barely recognizable, distorted by a mouth that was no longer fully human. "It wants vessels, to walk, to spread, the mine, tunnels, reaching other towns now. Water connects everything." Rebecca reached out toward the well, her fingers extending toward whatever was emerging. "I can hear it in my head," she said, her voice dreamy. "It's so old. It was here before there were trees, before there was light, and it's so hungry." Joseph obeyed, dragging Rebecca away, as she continued to make that awful sound. Martha followed, carrying Thomas, who had appeared at the edge of the trees. As they ran toward the house, Joseph looked back once. He saw his father standing at the well's edge, pick raised, as something emerged, something the official record describes as a sick bear or mountain cat, driven mad by rabies or starvation. But Joseph's sealed testimony uses different words, words that the court refused to transcribe, words that caused the clerk to stop writing and the sheriff to clear the room, words that only exist now as an absence in the record, marked by a notation. Witness testimony deemed unreliable due to extreme distress. What Joseph actually described, according to an unofficial transcript smuggled out by a sympathetic deputy, was this. It wasn't solid. It moved like water but had parts, limbs that weren't arms or legs, eyes that weren't eyes, a mouth that wasn't a mouth, and it was flowing into my father through every opening, his mouth, his nose, his ears. He was filling up with it like a water skin, and as it filled him, he changed. His body stretched, his joints bent backward, and his face split open like a seam. The deputy who recorded this testimony, one James Holloway, was transferred to another county shortly afterward. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed in that interview room. But his personal diary, discovered after his death in 1934, contained a single entry about the Carter case. What that boy described isn't possible. Human bodies don't work that way. Human minds don't think that way. But I believe him, God help me. I believe him because of his eyes when he told it, not the eyes of someone inventing a story, but the eyes of someone who has seen something that has broken his understanding of the world. I pray I never see such eyes again. I pray I never learn what he saw is real. What is recorded is that the family reached the house, that Martha barricaded the door with furniture, that they huddled in the front room as sounds of struggle came from the direction of the well. The impact of metal on something solid, Ezekiel's shouts of defiance, and another sound. A sound Joseph described as like water moving through pipes, but wetter, thicker, and with purpose. Inside the house, Martha moved with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment. She pulled floorboards up, revealing a cache of supplies, canned food, blankets, a shotgun, and boxes of shells. "We need to get to the Williams farm," she told Joseph. "There's a root cellar there with iron doors. It might hold." But her movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated, as if she were fighting against her own body. "It's in me, too," she whispered, her voice alternating between her normal tone and something deeper, more resonant. "Has been for months, slower than Ezekiel. I've been fighting it, but it's winning. You need to take Thomas and go. Rebecca, too, if you can. If not—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her eyes flicked to the shotgun. The meaning was clear. Rebecca sat in a corner, rocking, her arms wrapped around herself, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It wants to wear us. It wants to walk in daylight. It wants to find the others like it." Thomas had grown calm, almost unnaturally so. He sat at the kitchen table, drawing something on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. When Joseph glanced at the drawing, he saw a series of concentric circles with something in the center, something with too many angles, too many lines intersecting in ways that hurt the eyes to follow. "It's a map," Thomas said without looking up, "of where it came from, where it wants to go back to, once it has enough of us to make the journey." The boy's hand moved across the paper with fluid precision, creating patterns too complex, too perfect for an 11-year-old, or for any human hand. The drawing seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, revealing new depths, new dimensions that shouldn't have been possible on a flat surface. Joseph felt dizzy looking at it, as if the drawing itself was pulling at something inside him, trying to rearrange his thoughts to match its impossible geometry. Martha saw the drawing and lunged for it, ripping it from Thomas's hands and throwing it into the fire. "Don't look," she gasped. "Looking is how it starts, how it gets in, through the eyes first, then deeper." The sounds outside changed. The fighting stopped. The wet sounds grew louder. And then, just as the first gray light appeared in the east, something heavy struck the front door. Once, twice, 3 times. Wood splintered. Martha pushed her children toward the back door, but it was too late. The thing that came through the door wasn't Ezekiel Carter. Not entirely. Joseph's description is redacted in the official record, but Rebecca's isn't. She was deemed hysterical, her testimony unreliable. Perhaps that's why her words remain. It was wearing Pa like a suit that didn't fit right. Its limbs bent wrong, its face stretched over something else, and it was still hungry. What happened next is documented only in the briefest terms. Joseph grabbed his father's shotgun from above the mantel. The thing that had been Ezekiel lunged for Martha. Joseph fired. The first shot struck his father in the chest but didn't stop his advance. The second shot struck his head, and he fell. But he didn't stay down. Joseph described how the wounds caused by the shotgun didn't bleed red, but a thick, dark substance that moved independently of gravity, flowing upward along Ezekiel's body, gathering itself together, pulling the damaged tissue with it. The head wound began to close even as they watched, the shattered bone and brain matter reconstituting into something that approximated a human head but wasn't quite right, the proportions wrong, the features misaligned, as if whatever was controlling the body didn't fully understand human anatomy and was making its best guess. As the thing that had been Ezekiel began to rise again, Martha grabbed the oil lamp from the table and threw it. Flames spread quickly across the wooden floor and up the walls. "Run," she told her children. "Run, and don't look back. Tell people there was a fire, nothing more." But as Joseph turned to flee, he saw his mother changing too, her movements becoming more fluid, her joints bending in ways they shouldn't, her face beginning to shift. "Go," she said, but her voice was barely recognizable. "I'll hold it. Here, burn. Everything." The deputy's unofficial transcript includes a detail omitted from the official record. As the fire spread, the thing wearing Ezekiel Carter's body began to change. The heat seemed to affect it, Joseph reported. The flesh melted isn't the right word. It sloughed off like wax, but underneath wasn't bone. It was something else, something that moved and flowed and reached. And as the house burned around us, I saw it begin to flow back toward my father's body, trying to gather itself together again. Joseph, Rebecca, and Thomas fled as their home burned. Martha remained behind. When neighbors arrived to help battle the blaze, they found two charred bodies in the ruins, Ezekiel and Martha Carter, identified by their wedding rings, which somehow survived the inferno. The official cause was listed as tragic accident, oil lamp overturned during the night. The well was filled in with stones and cement by county workers, the property deemed uninhabitable due to potential coal seam subsidence. The remaining Carter children were sent to live with relatives in Ohio, their names changed to protect them from the scandal of their parents' alleged planned abandonment. Sheriff Harrison, who oversaw the investigation, retired unexpectedly 3 months later. He moved to Arizona, where the desert's dryness and lack of deep wells presumably offered some comfort. Before leaving, he sealed the records of the Carter case personally with a notation that they were not to be opened without federal authorization. In a private letter to the governor, discovered in state archives in 1975 but quickly resealed, Harrison wrote, "What we found at the Carter property goes beyond the scope of local law enforcement. I recommend immediate federal involvement and permanent quarantine of the site. The substance found in and around the well defies analysis by our local physician. It appears biological in nature, but behaves according to no natural laws with which we are familiar. Most disturbing are its apparent effects on living tissue and its ability to, I hesitate to use the word infect, but no other term seems appropriate. I have ordered the well sealed and the property condemned, but I fear these measures may be insufficient for long-term containment." Dr. Wilson, who performed the cursory examination of the bodies found in the ruins, reported findings consistent with death by fire. But his private medical diary, discovered after his death in 1928, contained a troubling addendum. The remains were too charred for proper autopsy, yet what I observed defies medical explanation. The internal organs, what remained of them, had been reorganized. The skeletal structure showed evidence of recent dramatic alteration. And within the abdominal cavity of the male subject, I discovered a substance unknown to science, neither solid nor liquid, organic, yet unlike any tissue I have encountered in 40 years of practice. Most disturbing of all, this substance continued to exhibit movement for several hours after death, before finally growing still. I have preserved a sample in alcohol, though I hesitate to study it further. Some knowledge is too terrible to pursue. The sample mentioned in Dr. C. Wilson's diary was never found. His office suffered a break-in the night after he wrote that entry, though nothing of obvious value was taken. The doctor himself developed a mysterious illness shortly afterward. Progressive tremors, vision disturbances, and periods of confusion that eventually forced him to abandon his practice. Before his death, he burned all his remaining papers and destroyed his medical equipment, actions his colleagues attributed to dementia, but which take on a more sinister significance in light of what we now know. And that might have been the end of the story, if not for what happened 50 years later, when the mining company decided to expand operations into the Forgotten Hollow. In 1950, industrial equipment was brought in to clear the long-abandoned Carter property. Workers began excavating for a new mine shaft entrance. During the excavation, they uncovered the sealed well. Despite warnings in county records not to disturb the site, the foreman ordered his men to break through the cement cap. Frank Delmond was one of the equipment operators present that day. In an interview conducted in 1973 by a graduate student researching Appalachian mining history, Delmond described what happened. "We didn't know what we were uncovering. Just looked like an old well to us. The foreman, Hughes, he told us to break through the cap so they could test the water table. Said it would save the company money if they could use existing structures. The cap was thick, nearly 2 feet of concrete. Took the better part of a day to break through. And the whole time there was this feeling like the air was getting heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear and cold. It got so cold near that well that we could see our breath in July. When we finally broke through, there was this sound, like a sigh, but deeper, like something that had been holding its breath for 50 years. And then the darkness came out." Delmond described how the substance that emerged from the well didn't flow like water, but moved with apparent purpose, seeking out the nearest workers, flowing up their bodies against gravity, entering through their eyes, their mouths, any opening it could find. Jenkins was the first, he said. He was operating the drill that broke through the cap. The stuff went straight for him, like it was targeting him specifically. Flowed up his legs, his torso, into his face, and he changed. Started moving wrong. His joints bent backward. His face rippled, is the only way I can describe it, like his features were fluid, rearranging themselves. What they found isn't recorded in any official document. What's recorded instead is that work was immediately halted, that the equipment was abandoned on site, that 3 workers went missing and were never found, and that the mining company purchased all surrounding properties at 3 times their market value, fenced off the entire hollow, and posted armed guards to keep people out. According to Delmond, whose testimony was never officially recorded, it wasn't like a gas or a liquid. It was like absence, an absence that moved with purpose. Jenkins was closest when we broke through. It took him first, flowed into him like water into an empty jar, and then he changed, started moving wrong, talking wrong, saying things about the others and the deep places, and how they would all come once the way was opened. Hughes tried to run. We all did. But Anderson and Miller, they didn't make it. The thing that used to be Jenkins caught them. And then there were 3 of them, moving like puppets with broken strings, coming for the rest of us. I made it to my truck. 5 of us did. We drove straight to the county sheriff. But when the authorities came back with us, there was nothing to find. Just the equipment, abandoned, no bodies, no Jenkins or Anderson or Miller. And the well had been covered again, not with concrete this time, with a kind of skin. A membrane that pulsed like it was breathing. Within 24 hours, government officials arrived, men in suits who identified themselves as being from the Department of Energy, though their credentials looked different from standard government ID, according to the sheriff's deputy who examined them. The entire area was cordoned off. A concrete structure was built over the well site, a structure that still stands today, regularly maintained and upgraded by workers who come in darkness and leave before dawn. Internal memos from the Department of Energy, partially declassified in 1997 under the Freedom of Information Act, but heavily redacted, make reference to the West Virginia anomaly and biological containment protocols Alpha 7. One memo dated August 1950 states, "Preliminary analysis indicates similarity to the redacted incident of 1927 and the redacted site in Montana. Recommend immediate implementation of isolation protocols and establishment of permanent monitoring station with Class 4 biohazard containment facilities. Under no circumstances should samples be transported off-site for analysis." A subsequent memo, dated October 1950, is even more disturbing. Evidence suggests subsurface spread beyond initial containment zone. Water table testing shows trace amounts of redacted up to 3.7 miles from the primary site. Recommend immediate testing of all wells and water sources within a 10-mile radius, with quarterly monitoring thereafter. Local population shows no signs of redacted at present, but vigilance is advised. Any reports of unusual behavior, particularly redacted or redacted, should trigger immediate quarantine protocols. Today, the area is officially designated as an environmental remediation zone. No access is permitted. Satellite images show only dense forest, where Hollow Creek once stood. But if you know someone who works for the Department of Natural Resources, if you can gain their trust over drinks on a cold night, they might tell you about the periodic inspections they're required to conduct. They might tell you about the cement structure they maintain, much larger now than a well cap should be. They might mention the strange equipment that monitors the site, equipment that measures not water quality or radiation, but pressure and movement. And they might whisper about the standing orders. If the alarms ever sound, they're not to investigate. They're to report directly to a special number in Washington, then evacuate the entire county. It's not just that well, confided one longtime DNR employee who spoke on condition of anonymity. There are others. Places where the mining went too deep. Places where they found things that should have stayed buried. The company knows. The government knows. But what can they do? Shut down all the mines? Tell people what's really down there underneath the coal seams? All they can do is contain it, monitor it, and pray that the caps hold. Joseph Carter died in 1972 in Cincinnati, still using the name he'd been given after fleeing Hollow Creek. But shortly before his death, he contacted a local reporter. The resulting interview was never published. The newspaper's editor deemed it the ravings of a senile old man. But the tape recording exists, preserved by the reporter's daughter, who later became an archivist at the State Historical Society. On that tape, Joseph's voice is thin but clear. "What we found wasn't from here," he says. "The mining woke it up, digging where they shouldn't. It was hungry after sleeping so long. Pod tried to keep it satisfied with animals, but it wanted more. It wanted us. And I think it's still down there, still hungry, still waiting for someone to let it out again." The most disturbing part of the recording comes near the end, when Joseph describes what happened to his siblings. "Rebecca was never right after that night," he says. "She would sit for hours, staring at nothing, drawing those same concentric circles over and over. Sometimes she would press so hard with the pencil that her fingers would bleed, but she wouldn't notice. 3 years after we moved to Ohio, she disappeared. Just walked out one night and never came back. The police searched, but there was no trace. But I know where she went. She went back to the well. It was calling her. It had been calling her since that night." And Thomas? Thomas held out longer, seemed to recover, got married, had a daughter. "But his wife told me that he would talk in his sleep, not in English, not in any language she recognized. And he was terrified of water. wouldn't bathe, would only take sponge baths, wouldn't even look at a well or a lake. He killed himself in 1943, left a note that just said, "It found me again. It's coming through the pipes. I can't let it take me like it took Pa." They found him in the bathtub with his wrists cut. The water was black, his wife said, black and thick, like oil. But it moved against the current, flowing up the drain instead of down. Joseph himself never married, never had children. The reporter who interviewed him noted that he lived in a small apartment with minimal furnishings and no running water. He collected rainwater in barrels and used an outhouse behind the building, despite having access to modern plumbing. His neighbors described him as polite but reclusive, a man who would cross the street to avoid walking over a manhole cover, who would become visibly agitated during rainstorms. The tape ends with Joseph's final warning. If you ever hear about Hollow Creek being reopened, run. Get as far away as you can, because some things should stay buried, and some wells should never be uncapped. Is Joseph Carter's story true? Was there really something unnatural in that Appalachian well? The official records say no, just a tragic accident, a family destroyed by fire, a coincidence that the land was later abandoned. But those sealed documents in Charleston tell a different story, as do the armed guards who still patrol a supposedly empty tract of forest, as does the special equipment monitoring a well that officially doesn't exist. And perhaps most telling of all, in all the decades since, despite the rich coal seams that run beneath it, despite the valuable timber that grows above, no one has ever tried to develop that land again. No one has attempted to reclaim Hollow Creek. Some places are best left alone. Some stories are best left untold. In 2018, a geology graduate student from West Virginia University attempted to conduct soil samples in the area as part of a study on long-term environmental impacts of historical mining operations. Her request for access was denied without explanation. When she tried to appeal, she was visited by two men claiming to be from the Department of Interior who advised her to choose a different research site. They left her with a non-disclosure agreement, which she signed. But before abandoning her research, she confided in her faculty advisor that satellite imagery of the site showed something unusual, a thermal anomaly centered on what appeared to be a concrete structure. The heat signature, she said, pulsed at regular intervals, like a heartbeat, but not human, slower, much slower, like something that measures time differently than we do. Her advisor suggested she seek counseling for academic stress. 2 months later, she left the program, citing personal reasons. She now works for a private environmental consulting firm that frequently contracts with the federal government. She does not respond to inquiries about her abandoned research, except here, in the dark, where we can pretend it's just a tale to frighten ourselves with, where we can close our laptops and walk away when it gets too disturbing, where we can tell ourselves that the Carter well was just a well and nothing more. But somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, in a hollow that no longer has a name, something waits beneath a cap of cement and steel, something that has been waiting for over a century, something that is very patient and very, very hungry. In 2023, a series of minor earthquakes was recorded in McDowell County. Nothing serious, tremors that barely registered on monitoring equipment. But they were unusual for the region, which is not known for seismic activity. The official explanation was settling of abandoned mine shafts. The unofficial response was an immediate increase in security around the restricted area and an upgrade to the monitoring equipment. A former security guard who worked at the perimeter for 6 months before quitting posted anonymously on a conspiracy theory forum about what he had witnessed. The post was removed within hours, the account deleted, but not before others had saved screenshots. The tremors weren't coming from below, he wrote. They were coming from inside the containment structure, like something was testing the walls. And after each tremor, the air would get colder. You could see your breath in August. And there was a smell, not like gas or chemicals, but like something rotting and fermenting at the same time, something old. The other guards, the ones who had been there longer, they said it was getting stronger, that the seals were weakening, that it was only a matter of time. If you ever find yourself driving through McDowell County and see a road that isn't on your map, a turn that seems to lead between two ancient ridges, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Some wells should remain covered, some stories should remain buried, and some hungers should never be awakened again. For those of you brave enough to have listened this far, remember that while this story comes from sealed records and whispered accounts, I make no claims about its absolute truth. Perhaps it was just the delusion of a traumatized family. Perhaps the mining company had more mundane reasons for abandoning the site. Perhaps. But if you find yourself near a well at night, if you hear sounds coming from its depths that sound almost like words, if you feel something reaching out from the darkness, remember the Carters and run. Local folklore in the counties surrounding the restricted area has incorporated elements of the Carter story, though the names and details have been changed over generations of telling. Children dare each other to approach the fence line. Teenagers spread rumors about government experiments gone wrong. Old-timers warn about digging too deep, disturbing things that slept in the earth long before humans walked above. One particularly persistent legend involves a substance locals call black water, a viscous fluid occasionally found seeping from abandoned mine shafts or appearing in remote streams after heavy rains. According to the stories, animals won't drink it. Plants wither if it touches their roots. And if it gets on your skin, you'll dream of deep places, of ancient hungers, of a darkness that predates the sun. Scientists who have analyzed samples say it's just a natural mixture of coal dust, mineral oil, and various bacterial colonies. Nothing supernatural, nothing dangerous beyond the usual contaminants found near old mining operations. But they don't explain why the samples sometimes disappear from laboratory storage, why equipment malfunctions during analysis, why researchers occasionally request transfers to different projects after working with the substance. Before I conclude tonight's tale, I want to share one final detail from those sealed records. When the Carter house burned in 1900, the local doctor examined the remains found inside. The official report states that both bodies were too badly burned for detailed autopsy. But the doctor's private notes, kept separate from the official record, mentioned something strange. The charred body identified as Ezekiel Carter had an unusually distended stomach, and when the doctor made an incision, he found inside not the normal contents of a human stomach, but a substance unknown to medical science, neither solid nor liquid, moving with apparent purpose even hours after death. The doctor's notes end abruptly after this observation. 3 days later, he closed his practice and moved to Baltimore, never to return to West Virginia. His notes were sealed along with the rest of the Carter case, deemed too disturbing for public record. In 2010, during routine digitization of historical medical records at Johns Hopkins University, where the doctor eventually established a new practice, an archivist discovered a sealed envelope among his personal effects. Inside was a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a black viscous substance, along with a note. Sample taken from Carter, remains 1900, has not evaporated, decayed, or changed in any way in 10 years of observation. Occasionally moves against gravity when unobserved. Do not open, do not study further. Upon my death, destroy without examining. The archivist reported the discovery to her supervisor. The vial was transferred to a secure storage facility pending proper disposal of what was assumed to be a hazardous historical medical sample. 3 days later, the storage facility reported that the sample was missing. Security camera footage showed no unauthorized access. The vial had simply disappeared. And in the decades since, on nights when the moon is new and the mountains are shrouded in darkness, locals say you can still hear sounds coming from the direction of Hollow Creek. Not quite human voices, but something trying to mimic them, something calling from deep in the earth, something still hungry after all these years. A group of hikers who strayed too close to the restricted area in 2019 reported hearing what sounded like children's voices coming from the forest, calling for help. When they attempted to locate the source, they found themselves walking in circles, always returning to the same lightning-struck oak tree. As darkness fell, the voices changed, becoming deeper, wetter, speaking words that the hikers couldn't understand, but that filled them with inexplicable dread. They fled, becoming separated in their panic. 2 made it back to their car. The third was found 3 days later, wandering along a highway 30 miles away, dehydrated and disoriented, with no memory of what had happened after dark. The only physical evidence of his ordeal was a strange, dark stain on his boots, a substance that evaporated before it could be analyzed, leaving behind a smell like old copper and older earth. Water testing in the counties surrounding the restricted area occasionally shows anomalous results, trace contaminants that don't match known industrial pollutants. The EPA classifies these as coal mining byproducts and assures residents that they pose no health risk. But local doctors have noted an unusual pattern of symptoms in some patients: unexplained tremors, sleep disturbances, and what one physician described in a medical journal as perceptual anomalies consistent with low-level neurological damage. The article was retracted shortly after publication, and the physician declined to comment further. In the mountains of West Virginia, water connects everything. Springs feed streams that join to form rivers that eventually reach the ocean. Underground aquifers spread beneath counties, states, crossing boundaries invisible from above. What enters the water in one place eventually reaches another, diluted perhaps, changed by its journey, but present nonetheless. And if something entered the water in Hollow Creek, something patient, something hungry, something that learned to wait during eons of darkness beneath the mountains, where might it have reached by now? Through how many pipes might it have traveled? Into how many homes? How many bodies? Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps the story ends with a sealed well and a burned homestead. Perhaps Joseph Carter was indeed just a traumatized old man, his memories distorted by time and tragedy. Perhaps the government maintains that restricted area for mundane reasons: environmental contamination, unstable mine shafts, nothing more sinister than the ordinary damage humans do to the earth in their search for resources. Perhaps. Lock your doors tonight. Check your wells, and remember, some stories aren't just stories.